Hello. Happy Wednesday. All right, so I thought today we could do a book read, and then after we'll work on a specific pose that kind of has to do with the book, and you might figure out what pose we're going to do after reading this book, because this book is called The Crow's Pear Blossom. So if you're thinking about what pose we're going to do, it has to do with this bird. Okay, so I'm going to read this first, and then we will work on that new pose. Okay, let me back up. Once upon a time, there were two crows who had a nest in a cottonwood tree at Pear Blossom. In a hole at the bottom of the tree lived a rattlesnake. He was very old and very big, and when he shook his rattles, the noise was so loud that it could be heard by the children at the school in Little Rock. Most of the time he slept, but every afternoon, punctually at 3:30, he used to crawl out of his hole, climb to the tree, and look into the crow's nest. If there was an egg in the nest, which there generally was, he would swallow it in one mouthful, shell and all. Then he crawled back into his hole and went to sleep again. Sneaky snake. He likes to eat the crow's eggs. When Mrs. Crow came home from the store, where she went every afternoon to buy her groceries, she would find the nest empty. What can have happened to my darling little egg?" she would say as she hunted high and low. But she never found it, so after tea she laid another one. This had gone on for a long time, when one day Mrs. Crow came home earlier than usual and caught Mr. Snake in the act of swallowing her latest egg. "Monster!" she cried. "What are you doing?" Speaking with his mouth full, the snake answered, "I'm having breakfast." And he glided down the tree and into the hole. When Mr. Crow came home that evening from Palmdale, where he worked as an assistant manager, he found his wife looking very pale and haggard, pacing up and down the branch outside their nest. "What's the matter, Amelia?" he said. "You look quite ill. You haven't been overeating again, have you?" "How can you be so coarse and unfeeling?" Mrs. Crow burst out. "Here I am working myself to the bone for you, and when I'm not working, laying fresh eggs every single day, except Sundays, of course. 297 eggs a year, and not a single chick hatched out. And all you can do is ask if I've been overeating. And when I think of that dreadful snake, I go all of a tremble." "Snake?" said Mr. Crow. "What snake?" "The one that ate all of my darling little eggs," said Mrs. Crow, and once again burst into tears. When the last she was able to explain what had happened, Mr. Crow shook his head. "This is serious," he said. "This is the sort of thing that somebody will have to do something about." "Why don't you go down to the snake's hole and get him?" said Mrs. Crow. "Somehow, I don't feel like that's a very good idea," Mr. Crow answered. "Abraham, you're scared," said Mrs. Crow. "Scared?" repeated Mr. Crow. "I never said I was scared. All I said was I didn't think it was a very good idea. Your ideas are seldom good, I may add. That's why I shall go to talk to my friend Owl. Owl's a thinker. His ideas are always good." So Mr. Crow's going to ask for advice from Owl. There's Owl. So he flew off to a tall poplar in Mr. Yost's garden, where the Old Man Owl had his home. Old Man Owl, who had worked on a night shift, had slept all day, was just getting up when Mr. Crow knocked on his door. "Come in, Abraham," he said. "Excuse my being in bedroom slippers." Mr. Crow took a seat, and while Old Man Owl shaved and combed his feathers, he told him the whole story. "Well," said Mr. Old Man Owl, when he had first finished, "there's obviously only one thing to be done." "What's that?" "Wait and see." And with that, Old Man Owl opened the door and flew down the middle of Mr. Yost's alfalfa patch, which had been irrigated that day and was still quite wet. "Oh, it's all muddy," said Mr. Crow as he landed beside his friend. "Abraham, you talk too much," said Old Man Owl. "Keep your beak shut and do exactly what I do." So saying, he took a big handful of mud and began to shape it into a form of an egg. Mr. Crow did the same, and when they were finished, the Old Man Owl flew up to the roof of Olivia's house, just where the chimney came up from the living room. The stove was burning and the chimney was very hot. Old Man Owl dropped the 2 eggs into the old tin can and placed the can on top of the chimney. So they're making egg shapes out of mud. There's the chimney, 2 chimneys. Then the 2 friends flew back to Owl's house and they had supper. By the time they had finished washing up and listening to the evening concert on the radio, it was 10 o'clock and the moon was shining brightly over the mountains. "I guess those eggs will be cooked by now," said Old Man Owl. So they flew back again to the chimney, and sure enough, the clay eggs had baked through and were as hard as a stone. "What's the color of your wife's eggs?" asked Old Man Owl. "Pale green," said Mr. Crow, with small black spots." "Well, it's lucky that Siggy has been doing some painting around the place," said Old Man Owl. And then, taking the can with the eggs, he flew down to the table outside the kitchen door, where there were several pots of paints and some brushes. When the eggs had been painted so, as it looked exactly like the real eggs, Old Man Owl and Mr. Crow dried them over the chimney, and then, about midnight, when the paint was quite hard, they flew back to the old cottonwood tree where Mrs. Crow was impatiently waiting for them. So they made fake eggs, and they're hard as stone. I wonder what they're going to do with them. "Well," she cried, "which one of you has decided to go down the hole and talk to Mr. Snake?" "Neither of us," said Mr. Crow. "Neither of you," screamed Mr. Crow. "Then must 297 of my darling eggs disappear down that vile serpent's throat. Must my heart go on being broken day after day forever?" "Amelia," said Mr. Crow, "you talk too much. Keep your beak shut and get out of your nest." Mrs. Crow did as she was told, and Old Man Owl took the eggs out of the can and placed them in the nest. "What are those for?" asked Mrs. Crow. "Wait and see," said Old Man Owl, and with that he flew off toward Llano, where he had an appointment with a friend. Next afternoon, Mrs. Crow went down to the store as usual to do her shopping. While she was gone, Mr. Snake woke up and, feeling hungry, came gliding out of his hole, up the tree, and along the branch to Mr. and Mrs. Crow's nest. "2 eggs today," he said. "Yum, yum." He smacked his lips, for his mother neglected his education and very bad manners. Then he stuck out his neck and swallowed 2 eggs whole, first one and then the other. So he swallowed those 2 eggs, but they aren't really eggs. They're hard as stone and made out of mud. Well, let's see. After that, he stretched himself long along the branch in the sunshine and began to sing a little song. "I cannot fly, I have no wings. I cannot run, I have no legs. But I can creep where the blackbirds sing and eat her speckled eggs. Ha, ha, and eat her speckled eggs." Suddenly he broke off. "Those eggs must have been very thick shells," he said to himself. "Generally, they break before they even get to my stomach, but this time it seems to be different." All at once, he began to have the most frightful stomach ache. "Ow!" he said. "Ooh, but the stomach ache only got worse and worse." "Oof!" he said. Mr. Snake began to writhe and wiggle and twist and turn. He's getting uncomfortable. And he twisted and turned so much that without knowing what he was doing, he tied his neck in a running bowline knot around a branch, and he couldn't get loose again. But his tail was still free, and he went on lashing. And he lashed so furiously, he coiled and corkscrewed into a complicated convulsion that at last he had got his tail tied up in a clove hitch around another branch of the tree. So there he was, and the harder he tried to get loose, the tighter the knot became. And all the time the clay eggs in his insides were giving him the most excruciating stomachache. It's all knotted up to a tree. Oh, here comes Mrs. Crow. By and by, Mrs. Crow came back from the store, and at first, when she saw the snake, she was frightened. But as soon as she noticed how tightly he had tied up himself, she felt very brave and proceeded to give the snake a very long lecture on the wickedness of eating other people's eggs. So he's stuck there, and Mrs. Crow is telling him why it's so awful to eat someone else's eggs. Ooh, look at all those crows. Since that time, Mrs. Crow had successfully hatched out 4 families of 17 children, and she uses the snake as a clothesline on which to hang the little crow's diapers. So there's all of her babies that have hatched, and there's the snake stuck on the branches, and she's using him as a clothesline to hang diapers. The end of the babies. Okay, so thinking about it, after reading this book, we're going to work on a pose called crow pose. So it's called crow because once you're in it, you can kind of imagine that you are a crow on a branch. Okay, so I'm going to get back here and show you how we can get into this pose. Hopefully you can see me. Okay. All right, so we're going to start off standing up, and we're going to squat. So I'm going to stand up like this. And if you want, you can have your feet closer together or farther apart. I'm going to put mine farther apart so it's easier to squat down. So I'm going to put my hands to my heart right here, and I'm just going to start to bend my knees. And as I bend my knees, I'm going to pretend that I'm sitting in a seat. So I'm going to come down really low, and once you come down, you can stay just like this, or if you want, you can put your hands on the ground. Okay, I'm going to come at an angle so you can see. So if you have a really wide stance, your feet can come out a little bit, your toes, and you can put your hands down on the ground like this. And this could be your crow. So you can stay just like this with your hands on the ground, and your legs might be wings, and your hands right here might be crow's feet. If you want to go a little bit farther, you can come down with your knees closer together, and I'm coming up on my heels, so my heels are up and I'm putting all my weight on my toes. And then you can take your hands and you can put them on the ground here. I'll show you from the side. Okay, so this is another way to be a crow. Or if you want to come even farther than that, then you're going to come back down with your knees up, and this time I'm going to put my feet farther apart and let my knees come out, and my hands are going to come on the ground like this. All right, this is where it gets pretty tricky. So I have my knees out here against my legs, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to shift my weight forward, and my head's going out in front of me. So I'm going to shift my weight forward, and as you start to shift, you're going to put lots of weight on your hands, so really press against the ground, and your feet can stay on the ground like this, or if you want, you can try to lift one foot at a time. My cat's right there. Eventually, you might be able to lift both of your feet up like a crow. So my hands are on the ground like crow's feet, and my knees are in the air like my crow's wings. Okay, so we can do that again. So we'll start the beginning part. So if you want to start in a squat and put your hands down, and this could be your crow. If you have farther than this, you're going to bring your knees to the outside of your arms and start to shift weight forward. And as you come forward, you might be able to lift up one leg and then switch. Or you might be able to shift so far forward, heavy on your hands, that your feet come up. like a crow. Okay, so you can work on that at home, and you can start with your feet on the ground. Maybe you lift one up, maybe you can get both feet up, but make sure your hands are on the ground, fingers are spread, and you're shifting forward, okay? All right, I will see you all on Friday at 11:30. Bye, everyone.